Good morning, everybody. Good morning, those of you who are joining on the stream. You're listening to Global Affairs Unfiltered. I'm Jack Stockwell, and I'll be here for a little while this morning. I am hopefully broadcasting at the same time on K-Talk Radio. With the new system, I'm not sure what they're doing or how they're doing it or what's going on, but at least I can get something going here with the stream. So good morning, welcome. Those of you who, if you're listening on K-Talk Radio, you might let me know that you can hear me broadcasting. That would help a lot. The real answer to this, the ability to do this job correctly, I think, would simply be to do the show from the studio, but the studio is down in Linden, and I live in Draper. Oh, listen to me. I've got my belly aching started already early this morning. Anyway, I am happy to be here, and as we are getting closer and closer to the inevitability of this grave, well, it's no longer an inevitability. It's the escalation, the grave escalation of the threat of direct military strikes and warfare against Iran by the United States, with involvement, of course, from Britain. They don't want to be left out of this. They can't fight a war by themselves. They're impotent in that regard. I mean, even their aircraft carriers are in trouble in port. They've had some trouble with some of their submarines as well. I mean, England's in trouble. They're in trouble financially, they're in trouble politically, they're in trouble immigrationally. And the one thing that unites the forces and the efforts and the dynamics inside of Great Britain now is to destroy the Trump presidency. Because England, about the only way, not the only way, one of the major ways England can get out of the mess they're in is direct war between NATO and Russia, because of the funding that could take place as a result of that. And because Trump seems to be making peaceful waves with Russia and wants to, thanks, Paul, and wants to be able to establish ties with Russia in the sense of development between the two nations, this is antithetical to what the British Empire wants. Because the British Empire can't have the Empire of China and the Empire of Russia growing ever stronger as they are and maintain a piece of the empire itself. The British Empire, I think, is a thing of the past, and they desperately want to see the Trump presidency end, which is one of the reasons why they're pushing for a direct strike on Iran, because if Trump were to go ahead and allow this to happen, it'll be the end of his presidency. So there's, grave concern about this direct threat, and as I said, Britain would be involved. Terrible, obviously, in its implications of needless death and havoc spreading throughout that region. It's part of the effort to stop this renewed diplomatic relations that are going on between the United States and Russia, whose potential cannot only resolve the Ukrainian crisis, but that of other conflicted areas and the current horrors that are going on in Western Asia, especially Southwest Asia, especially tinier and tinier areas like the Middle East. When I talk about Western Asia, you have to get into Africa, down to the Sudan, and then all the way up through Iraq, and then all the way over to Pakistan and over to Bangladesh. And then you're in Central Asia. But Southwest Asia in particular, referring primarily to the Middle East. So in recent days, there's been this exchange of letters. I talked about it yesterday between the United States and Iranian government leaders concerning Iran's nuclear energy capacity, their military capacity, their nuclear and non-nuclear related issues. So March 30, which was 2 days ago, I guess now, the Iranian President Pezeshkian said that during a cabinet meeting that the path for indirect negotiations remains open. He says it's the behavior of the Americans that will determine the continuation of this negotiation process. The U.S. has begun massing, and this is, I reported on this quite a bit yesterday. I have more to report on it today. Massive, significant naval, air, troop capabilities in that region. Yes, troops. And President Trump said, what is today, Tuesday? He said Sunday. Trump said Sunday on NBC News, if they don't make a deal, there will be bombing. Now, imagine you're part of the Iranian delegation in Washington, D.C., and the President of the United States on national television says, if they don't make a deal here, there is going to be bombing. Then he said, there's a chance that if they don't make a deal, we'll do secondary tariffs like we did 4 years. He said, like I did for 4 years. So today, and remember, it's getting towards the end of the day in Iran right now. While we were sleeping, put it that way, while we were sleeping, Ali Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader, said that, and I quote, if any hostile act is committed from outside, though the likelihood is not high, it will undoubtedly be met with a strong counter-strike. And he said this during his early morning sermon for the Eid al-Fitr. I'm not sure what that is, something in Iran. And he said this during his sermon, and the Iranian Foreign Affairs military spokesman posted on X just a little while ago, an open threat of bombing by the head of state against Iran is a shocking affront to the very essence of international peace and security. Amen. I say amen to that. I don't know why in the world Trump would make a comment like that. If the negotiations cease, there will be bombing. Why would we be bombing Iran? When's the last time you woke up in the middle of the night, walking the floor, your hands in a prayer mode, racked with conflict and anxiety over what Iran was going to do to America that day? If you're like me, it's been a long, long time since you worried about anything like that. Maybe back to the Carter presidency when they took over the embassy. So, while we were coming to the end of the previous administration and the clouds of war gathering to the point where we were afraid they were going to let loose the dogs of war in the Ukraine, in the sense of long-range, even medium-range missiles from America being delivered to the Ukraine that could hit Moscow in 5 minutes of launch. And seeing those clouds finally disperse, and then as soon as Trump is inaugurated, the clouds kind of disappear quickly because Trump is not going to send those missiles. He's going to cut everything off, but then he turns things back on, and then he slows things down, and then he speeds things up. It's very difficult to predict anything with a head of state who acts like this. Now, I'm not judging him or criticizing him for acting like this. This is just who he is. And so it keeps everybody else on the edge of their seats. But when the Ukrainian thing slowed down a bit, the Iranian thing starts taking off. And I go back to my question. Why in the world is Trump talking about bombing Iran? Might it have something to do with a tiny little country further west than Iran, with another country of Jordan in between them? So now we have the clouds of war darkening again. and the havoc, the absolute havoc that would be spread across the region, and all the larger context and implications that would follow, let alone you having to walk because you can't afford gasoline anymore in this country. And I don't understand. You know, I've studied this. I've studied this for decades. And remember this. Iran is not a country, a third world country in the Dark Ages. Iran is a highly technological country that is in possession of hundreds, if not thousands, of Russian missiles. And they don't have to be nuclear tipped. Just conventional warheads. And we've already seen in the test launchings last year and the year before of Iran sending missiles to Israel and the failure of the Iron Dome for the most part. Yeah, the Iron Dome shot down a few, but there were a lot that got through that hit military bases. Now, if we were to strike Iran, as Trump has intimated, if they don't deal, and the deal, of course, is to put their nuclear development to rest, and they're not going to do that. They might, all right, we will not upgrade and refine our nuclear fuel past what we need for our nuclear reactors. And you can come and see. You can check this stuff out. We will not take it to weapons grade enrichment. We'll just, you know, we have a lot of people in this country, and we're a very highly developed country. And we have electricity all over the place. And we have water all over the place. You know, just like Gaza could do, if Gaza put in a couple of small nuclear plants for desalination and turn that area into a garden. We already know it can happen because it happened in the northeast areas of Qatar and the northeast areas of Saudi Arabia through massive desalination projects, turned it into farmland. So the Supreme Leader made a very interesting statement. In light of the fact that they're in possession of a lot of Russian missiles, and if they get attacked, those missiles are going to be launched. And they don't have to have nukes. Just a couple hundred of those missiles hitting a couple hundred targets in Israel. And Israel will be over with. It will literally be over with. But he said something that I thought was really interesting. The Supreme Leader, Al Khamenei, said, "You think we don't know where the Gulf of Mexico is?" Now think about that for a minute, because he didn't mean what it immediately sounds like. Now, I'm not interpreting the mind of the Supreme Leader, but think about what he said when you don't think we know where the Gulf of Mexico is? Here, now it's a Gulf of America. And the Gulf of America borders America. And so he's indirectly saying, you don't think we know where America is? So confrontation with Iran is one of the traps that have been set for President Trump. And it looks like he's ready to spring it. And remember, behind every event that's going on, there's another event. And behind that, there's another event. And behind that is the crowd of people whose names you've never even heard of, probably never will hear. They're the ones that, oh my goodness, who sent that to me? That comment by Woodrow Wilson. This is apparently attributed to Woodrow Wilson. I think it is. He said, "Since I entered politics, I have chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture." Oh. I have no way of controlling that.
The March of Dimes and HCA Healthcare are committed to the best possible
So for those of you on the stream, I got to wait for the commercials to finish at K Talk before I go on there. But the thing that I'm going to talk about, this is too, I hope, I don't want this to carry through on the stream. Obviously, what's, all right, it sounds like that interruption might be over with at K Talk. I can get back to what I'm talking about. The reason why the European leaders, the Western stuff, wants Trump out of there is because they don't want peace with Russia. They don't want peace with Iran. They don't want peace with Hamas. They want war with all of these. You can't have all these hedge funds that are hanging on the edge of bankruptcy because of the complete collapse of the economic system of the West. And by economic system, I mean City of London to Wall Street and the little parasites that live off of that. If you have peace, you can't have, you've got to have fear. You have to have war. You have to have the fear of war. You have to have the fear of destruction to keep these things going. And so this escalation leading to havoc across not just that region, but the entire world, this confrontation with Iran is one of the key traps that have been set for President Trump. And this Signal Gate thing was a MI6 operation from the beginning to take out Gabbard and Patel and Waltz, to get them out of the way so that false information can continue to be given to President Trump that will lead to war, pretty well controlled out of Tel Aviv and Haifa. And so in this attempt, these efforts to take down Trump and the other key figures that are associated with him, most importantly, and the world important normalization with U.S.-Russia relations. If you could bring peaceful relations between U.S. and Russia, there are so many hot spots around this planet that would calm down overnight. And Signal Gate, of course, is being used for this purpose. So Trump may well be known for his erratic behavior, but along comes the British with their obvious smarmy operations to manipulate and trap him. And you just look at this, what's happened over the past weekend. Finnish President Alexander Stubb, who's a very proud Anglophile, paid a visit to Mar-a-Lago, played around at golf with President Trump and Senator Lindsey Graham, probably the most pin-headed war hawk in the Senate. And then when Stubb left, he went straight to London to meet with MI6 and with Prime Minister Keir Starmer. And then Trump and Starmer spoke Sunday over the phone. And these two leaders decided to keep collective pressure going on Putin. And then Trump began yesterday by choosing to talk tough about Putin on NBC News in front of the NBC News audience. And so the transatlantic controlled media, squawking on cue that Trump may have finally started to understand, Donald, you simply cannot trust Putin. So Stubb, the president of Finland, said, I think we're probably, and he's quoted in The Guardian today, it was in this morning's Guardian. He says, I think we're probably moving into the direction where the Americans are seeing Russia for what it's worth. The half ceasefire has been broken by Russia. My sense is also President of the United States is running out of patience with Russia. However, from the Kremlin also today in an English translation release, Dmitry Peskov took the high road with somewhat measured remarks. He said that the negotiations are ongoing with Ukraine, and as for the discussions of the Black Sea Agreement, a work in progress, and as for another telephone call with President Trump, which Trump has suggested, Peskov reported, there is no such telephone conversation currently planned on the agenda. I would like to reiterate that President Putin remains open for such discussion, but such a telephone call could be organized quite promptly if it was necessary. So the British-French coalition for the willing, the European Union, rearm Europe, reassurance force, something like that for Ukraine, can see as just as ludicrous, except that it's deadly. And the militarization demand they're pushing is, in actuality, another financial bubble. And the terminal bubble in the sequence of bubbles following this global green fraud pushed by the political financial centers of the city of London and Wall Street and satellites, and the war economy bubble is untenable. So as for the leading figures of Starmer and Macron and others that are just toy soldier versions of Napoleon, playing with nuclear fire, and so the rallies and the voices against them are just rising rapidly in Europe. This massive demonstration in Wiesbaden the other day. And so this Franco-British imperial alliance for war, because both of them, both France and England, have said, well, we can put troops in there, peacekeeping troops. Putin, of course, said they'll be targets if you do that. Just remember, you put them on the ground in Ukraine, they will become targets. But they keep pushing for it. And so massive demonstrations have now shown up in the streets of France. They said this: we are here in the streets to save France. This is a tragedy because they want us to attack an enemy we don't have, with money and weapons we don't have. They want to make us rearm by plundering our savings and pushing us further into debt as if it weren't bad enough. And they're very well of the traps that are being laid for Trump, the traps laid for what populations are supposed to think. So, as you go along here, what I want you to keep in mind by the time today's show is over with, is that all these little hobgoblins that are showing up on the scene, whether it's Signalgate or whether it's threat to bomb Iran if they don't talk, these are all things, these are traps to stop the Trump presidency. And I predict that if Trump goes ahead with this bombing, and I think it's still the art of the deal thing. I think he's just threatening, but I don't think he's stupid enough to do this. But if he were to bomb Iran, with, of course, Israel pushing the buttons, that'll be the end of his presidency. I doubt he would last till June before he's out of there. Now, the Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei warned yesterday that any evil action against Iran will draw a harsh retaliatory response. He says this: first, if any hostile act is committed from outside, though the likelihood is not high, it will undoubtedly be met with strong counter-strike. And second, if the enemy, as in previous years, seeks to incite internal sedition, the nation will respond decisively to the instigators, just as it has in the past. So the Iranian Foreign Affairs Ministry spokesperson, Bakiai, I heard it pronounced that way, hit back on President Trump for threatening Iran with bombings, saying such shocking comments jeopardize international security and violate the UN Charter. He said this: an open threat of bombing by the head of state against Iran is a shocking affront to the very essence of international peace and security. It violates the United Nations Charter, betrays the safeguards under the IAEA. Violence breeds violence. Peace begets peace. The U.S. can choose the course and concede to its consequences. So his statement came after Trump had told NBC News' Kristen Welkeran on Sunday that if the Iranians, don't make a deal, there will be bombing. You know, it's one thing for President Trump to say something like that in some private meeting, and it kind of leaks out, and then it ends up in a press conference. And so in the press room, someone says, there was somebody who said out in the hallway that the president might want to bomb Iran if Iran doesn't deal. That's one thing. It's another thing for the man in charge of the military forces, of the greatest military force on the planet, saying, we're going to bomb you. You deal or we're going to bomb you. Now that's different. So Khomeini's warning followed a statement made on Sunday by the Iranian president, Pezeshkian, in which he reported that Iran has responded in a recent letter from Trump through Omani mediators, emphasizing that the path of negotiations with Iran will be completely dependent on Washington's behavior. Pezeshkian said Iran has never shied away from negotiations. It's only the broken promises by the other side that have damaged the trust, you know, kind of like what Putin says about the West. So Pezeshkian said, while the response rules out the possibility of direct talks between the two sides, it says that the path for indirect negotiations remains open. Now, a couple other things that I want to also cover is that the Associated Press reported yesterday that Gaza's bakeries will run out of flour for bread within a week. One of the food sources that have gotten through that the IDF hasn't shot to pieces or burned up on the roadside is flour. And the flour has been dispersed to the various bakeries in Gaza that are still standing. And AP yesterday said they're going to run out of flour within a week. Now AP also said that not a single pound of food has gone into the Gaza Strip since Israel closed all of the Gaza crossings on March 2nd. So for a month now, no food has gone into Gaza. So as a result, the humanitarian aid agencies have had to cut the food distributions to families in half, and markets are almost completely devoid of any kind of vegetables. And a lot of the aid workers cannot move around because their vehicles are being targeted by the IDF for sniper shots, and moving vehicles can be bombed by drones. Oh, jeez. You can't make this up. Eventually, AP noted this catastrophic surge in severe hunger and malnutrition that's going on. And they said that if the flow of aid is not restored, because the war has destroyed almost all local food production in Gaza. Gaza was growing their own food, but all the farming areas have been bombed or burned to a crisp. So the World Food Program said last Thursday that its flour for bakeries is only enough to keep producing bread for 800,000 people a day until today, and that its overall food supplies will last a maximum of 2 weeks. And as a last resort, once all the other food is exhausted, they have emergency stocks of fortified nutritional biscuits for 415,000 people. So the fuel and the medicine will last weeks longer before hitting zero. But the hospitals are running out of antibiotics, they're running out of painkillers. Aid groups are shifting limited fuel supplies between multiple needs, all indispensable: trucks to move the aid, bakeries to make the bread, wells and desalination plants to produce water, and hospitals having enough fuel available to keep their machines running. Do you ever think about this? I have some extended family that think Israel's totally justified in everything they're doing because of October 7th. And I said to him, Are you aware that the Jerusalem Post, Haaretz, the Times of Israel, have all reported on one occasion or more that most of the people that were shot and killed on October 7th were shot and killed by the IDF using the Hannibal Doctrine? Hardly a word has been spoken between us since. Absolutely refuse to believe that. Israel's own press covering that. Well, I got more I want to say about that, but I want to talk a little bit more about Alexander Stubb and his little golf game with the president Sunday. Stubb says Trump now understands that Putin cannot be trusted, but all the Europeans can be trusted. What would have had to have gone on between Trump and Stubb playing golf Sunday at Mar-a-Lago for Stubb to come out of that game and being asked by the press what's going on, and Stubb says, President Trump now understands he can't trust Putin, but he can trust the Europeans. Now just think about that for a second. The absolute absurdity of that statement. Then he gets on a plane and he immediately flies to one of his bosses, Prime Minister Keir Starmer in London. And according to the presidential office of Finland, while he was there, he had a meeting with Richard Moore, who's chief of the UK Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, as well as making an address to the students at the London School of Economics. Jeez, it's just so obvious. It's just so obvious. And Stubb as much as described himself as a British agent when he met with Starmer. He told reporters that he feels a little left out because 75% of his family hold dual British-Finnish citizenship. And he doesn't. He said, I'm glad to see the leadership that the UK is showing, not least in the war in Ukraine, and in many ways, in my own mind, the UK is back in the game. With what? They can't even use their nukes without American support. He said, I think Finland and the UK are tied hip to hip in so many places, including NATO, of course, which you guys, pointing to the Joint Expeditionary Forces, you guys founded. So Stubbs' favor of a ceasefire in Ukraine it's just theater. He's a very fervent member of the European War Party, the so-called Coalition of the Willing, preparing to take over the war against Russia if they can't get Trump to drop his bid for peace. And this is the cow in the room. This is what the London Playbook dubbed it as, the cow in the room, not the elephant in the room, the cow in the room, which President Trump had better consider, they said. Stubb wants more sanctions on Russia, Ukraine, and to NATO, and become part of the EU, and claims that it was Finland's initiative. And so Stubbs' intervention into American affairs was also very carefully choreographed, ahead of time, all this stuff, to make a point, to become another setup for Trump to fail, to destroy his presidency if he tries to establish peace with Russia. And when you consider how the Europeans were reeling back away from Vice President Vance's statements during the Munich Security Conference back in February. Stubb was bragging to Politico, this is in Politico this morning, that he was already on the case of winning Trump over to Europe's war cause. Now, with the amount of intelligence gathering that the United States has, and Tulsi Gabbard sitting at the top of willowing through all of this stuff, you don't think she told the president before Stubb showed up what Stubb was up to? or that Trump himself didn't have enough intelligence, in general from most European sources and Finnish sources, what Stubb was up to. Of course they knew ahead of time. And so they've already gone out golfing twice. He says he's already spoken to Trump twice about selling him on the Finnish icebreakers, which are critical to the battle for the Arctic that Trump has taken a very great interest in vis-a-vis Greenland. And maybe you've seen what Putin has had to say about this lately. Putin, and I'm paraphrasing it, I'm not putting words in his mouth, but I'm sure you've seen it, where he has said essentially any encroachment against Russian sovereign territory in the Arctic will be met with. So what is encroachment in the Arctic against Russian sovereign? If you look at a polar map of the Earth with the North Pole in the middle, and you look like half of the Earth is covered by Russia, and the only way they get around up there is with icebreakers. The major port is Murmansk in the northern part of Russia. And that's only open 3 or 4 months of the year. The rest of it, they have to use icebreakers. And Finland, its only real ocean is the Arctic, and they specialize in icebreakers. And so this ridiculous talk going back and forth, if you stop these silly notions of peace with Putin, we'll make the deal on the icebreakers that you're going to need to protect the northern end of Greenland once it's yours. Like I said, I mean, I don't even know if Tom Clancy could come up with stuff like this. But as for his American connections, the president of Finland studied at South Carolina's Furman University because of his golfing prowess, leading him to describe himself to Politico as Finnish by birth, but Southern by the grace of God. A common saying in the South, those of you who are familiar with this. So late on Sunday, President Trump and British Prime Minister Starmer are talking on the phone. And this is from the UK readout. The Prime Minister spoke to President Trump this evening. The President opened by wishing His Majesty the King best wishes and good health. They discussed the productive negotiations between their respective teams as a UK-US economic prosperity deal, agreeing that these will continue at pace this week. Discussing Ukraine, the Prime Minister updated the President on the productive discussions at the meeting of the Coalition of the Willing in Paris this week. The leaders agreed on the need to keep up the collective pressure on Putin. They agreed to stay in touch in the coming days. As of 24 hours later, the White House has yet to see fit to report on the call, interestingly enough. It wasn't that big a deal in the White House. The only thing President Trump himself pointed out on his Truth Social, that Starmer had informed him that the terrorist who had damaged his Trump Turnberry golf course in the UK some 3 weeks ago had been caught and they're in prison, for which he thanks Starmer. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. All right. So the clouds of war are clearly getting darker and more dangerous as this buildup of a possible war between Iran and the U.S., possibly the U.K. as well. And the signs are increasing. As I was talking about yesterday, the reports over the last several days of the number of B-2 stealth bombers being delivered to Diego Garcia. And then the escalation in the vocal exchanges between Trump and the Iranian government, where Trump basically threatened to do very bad things. Very bad things would happen if Iran would not make a deal, and I think it was not only the nuclear program, but also the missiles that's completely unacceptable for the Iranians, and several of their top military commanders have said no in no uncertain terms We're not going to give up these missiles. Are you out of your mind? You know, it's just like Putin saying, no, we're not going to give up the territories we've taken. Are you out of your mind? And so several of their top military commanders have essentially put their foot down. No, we're not going to give up these missiles. They don't have nuclear warheads, but they're pretty bad missiles. We're not going to give them up. So the commander of the Iran Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Ali Reza Tangsiri, well, for some reason, there was a station ID. This showed up at K-Talk. All right, so the commander of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard said this: I observed these actions and I prepare myself to counter them. We have the capability to strike all enemy bases, wherever they may be, even in the Gulf of Mexico. And Iran will never negotiate over its missiles or the capability of the resistance front. That's why I say crazy things like the storm clouds of war that seem to disperse in the Ukraine with Biden's refusal to send those missiles. Thank you, President Biden. Or the world may have gone up in thermonuclear fire by now. And now it's in Iran. The storm clouds of war are gathering again. Germany is talking about getting the draft going. In Germany, the power of the Bundeswehr, the military forces, are now in violation of some local, I don't know if it's policies or laws, are now in the high schools trying to conscript high school students for the German army so that they can be war ready by 2029. And here you have the commander of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard saying, we have the capability to strike all military bases. In other words, if the attack comes from Diego Garcia and the two other, the Carl Vinson, I think, is already there. 2 more aircraft carriers are on their way. Probably the Ford and the Reagan. I don't know that for sure. I just assume that's what it is because they were there earlier. Then they went out for refueling, retooling, and rearming. And now we're back to where we were before. And why? This is a British operation to topple the Trump presidency. And what do you want to watch for here? What are the earmarks? What are the pieces in the game that you can watch for that lets you know we're getting closer and closer to D-Day, Destruction Day? And that is, the more Trump makes peace with Putin, the more war talk between the United States and Russia calms down, and the more there are delegations and diplomacy movements between the two countries to stop the sanctions, to open up trade, and reestablish economic partnership between the United States and Russia, the closer we will be to thermonuclear nightmare. Because England, and I don't, when I say that, and you know what I mean. You know I don't mean the British people. They're in the streets protesting too. I mean the city of London, the city of Brussels, the city of Frankfurt, the city of Zurich and Basel, where the economic centers of world power are located, but especially Brussels and London. Now, I think, in a certain sense, this gives you the aroma, how close we are to potential disaster. And I've tried to identify, yesterday, in no uncertain terms, this would not only create havoc in the Middle East, havoc. I mean, what you saw here over the last couple of years of missile fire and limited warfare between Israel and Iran, sending missiles back and forth, is nothing compared to what Iran will launch if they are attacked. And the entire region will go up in flames. But it could also have such a blowback against Trump that it would decapitate his administration. Because you look at the fine line in the House between the Republicans and the Democrats. And if Trump is to attack Iran, how many of the Republicans are going to support that? As long as it looks good, as long as it makes Trump look good, as long as it makes the Republican House look good and the Republican Senate, they'll support it. But as soon as the wind changes, like $10 a gallon gasoline, and food prices, and everything that gasoline will affect, like food prices, energy prices. I mean, almost anything we buy is energy dependent to some degree in the sense of manufacturing or delivery. How long will the Republicans continue to support that when the rest of the country is demanding impeachment of the president? So the blowback would absolutely decapitate the Trump administration if Trump attacks Iran. You can write that one down. And first of all, we already have signs of his MAGA supporters, the entire region. In the sense of comparing to the Christian Zionist supporters, that they're extremely unhappy about the strikes against the Houthis in Yemen, because Trump promised to end all the wars, not start new ones. It's one of the reasons why the power of the MAGA movement was because of all the wars previously from George Bush Jr. and then with Obama, and then that continued through the first administration, 45, and then definitely geared up in higher speed levels with Biden, and then Trump saying, no, I'm the peace president. We're going to end wars. And then, as I talked about yesterday over the weekend, 65 bombing strikes in 24 hours on Yemeni civilians. And in addition now, not ending some of this stuff, but the starting of a new war, especially with Iran, and subsequent, the oil would be at least temporarily shut down. I mean, it could explode the oil price to astronomical figures that would lead to a blowout of the financial system, as I talked about yesterday. So this, of course, is not only extremely dangerous because one does not know exactly what the Russian engagement would amount to. It's very clear that Russia has already provided Iran with top-notch missiles and other equipment, so it's a powder keg of no small dimensions that needs to be there on the number one or two issues on the agenda for today. If you attack Iran, what's Russia going to do? Now, Russia and Iran do not have a defense treaty, but they kind of have something indirect. And so if Russia were to be drawn into that, some of its attention would come off of the Ukraine. Now, the aim of the British Empire is to decapitate the Trump administration. That's been announced since the House of Lords report back in 2018. And this so-called Signalgate scandal, even though the exact details have yet to be completely unearthed, nevertheless, it has the design and the handwriting of British counterintelligence operation, and you know it is helped naturally by the enormous amount of incompetence of Trump's national security team. How in the world they could do something so stupid as to have their bombing plans of Yemen on an easily accessible app. Maybe that was part of the British operation, to set it up like that. I mean, any thinking high security person would have known right away there was something wrong with that, unless they came in through the back door. I mean, you can't let the Brits be free of this. Because the fact that the heads of the DNI, the FBI, the CIA, they're all not paying attention to what kind of channel they're using to discuss top secret plans to attack another country militarily. I think it's even worse than incompetence. And it has nothing to do with anything else, and still a deep state operation against them. Nevertheless, that should never have been allowed to happen. And the left, the progressives, are not going to be happy until Gabbard is fired and Patel is fired, and yeah, the head of the CIA is fired. So another aspect of this political situation. Let me say this: we're coming up to the top of the hour. I know I've been rambling and going all over the place in the weeds and in and out. I've got more things to talk about, but we're going to go to break, and the top of the hour news break is going to play at K-Talk. I will continue I will mute myself at K-Talk's station, and but I will continue to talk and broadcast here over the stream at X and at YouTube. Now, if you're listening to the radio broadcast and you want to continue to hear what I'm talking about, you've got to go to youtube.com/@Global Affairs Unfiltered. All one word. youtube.com/@Global Affairs Unfiltered. There we go. All right. I'm going to mute. I'm going to mute what I have to say at K-Talk until the news and everything is over with, and I'll tune them back in. But for those of you on the stream, let me see here. Oh, there's a lot of you there. Oh, wonderful. I'm going to continue talking. To tell you the truth, my goal is to move exclusively to the stream. So anyway, another aspect of this political situation is the very erratic behavior of Trump that I mentioned earlier. And naturally, this is a pleasure for the British. The Guardian, I gotta turn that down. The Guardian just goes haywire, as does a lot of the other British media, about Trump's recent remarks about Putin, that he's very angry with Putin over the Ukraine. I think he even used the term pissed off in various things, pissed off with Putin. And then again, when you hear him say stuff like this, when you hear this coming out of his mouth, you kind of have to estimate, or not estimate, you just have to understand where he's coming from. And this is a part of his erratic behavior. Is he erratic because he is schizophrenic? Or is he erratic because that's just the way he deals? And he says alarming things. He will say some of the craziest stuff you can imagine, and then the other side starts dealing, like what's going to happen this week with the tariffs. Are they really going to go through with that stuff, or are both sides to some degree going to back down a little bit for the art of the deal, come to an agreement between the two of them, and then drop the tariff prices? Well, he carries that same kind of thinking and dynamic into the political world, where thermonuclear missiles can be launched as a result of some of these things. So I'm just mentioning this to show that this whole situation remains fragile. And even though I think still we are in a situation where the potential of the normalization of relations between the United States and Russia is the most important thing right now. And all the other operations are just bluff and flurry and the tempest in a teacup type of thing against, even the attempted sabotage of any ceasefire by the Ukraine by the coalition of the willing. Now, it's also clear that the Baltic countries that are a part of the coalition of the willing, despite their tiny little size, are among the biggest warmongers. And they are, according to the Financial Times, the most against any ceasefire in the Ukraine. Estonia, Latvia, and the other one. Little tiny countries that border Russia that are the most against any kind of a ceasefire. And so what they're worried about, the thing that these Baltic countries are screaming about, is that once the war is over, Russia will redistribute its forces. And that means the level of threat against them would increase very quickly. And this is a statement by the Estonian Defense Minister, Hanno Pevkur. So these small countries are definitely being used to the hilt to talk up the war danger. But the reality, naturally, is the role of the British as the instigator. It always has been. And then the dumb giant across the ocean, the United States, carrying out the policies of the British Empire during the previous administration, is now coming out absolutely without any question. It's obvious who's in control. And there's this big article in the New York Times. Apparently there was this big investigation into a secret U.S.-Ukraine partnership, and the New York Times article reveals that the Biden administration practically deployed the Pentagon very shortly after the special military operation started in February of 2022, gosh, now 3 years ago, obviously beefing up the training that they had been doing since 2014 with the Maidan, overthrowing a duly elected president of Ukraine and getting the Ukraine war ready for war with Russia over the next several years. And this, of course, was revealed by Angela Merkel and Hollande, that they only pretended to agree with the Minsk Accords in order to gain time to train the Ukrainians up to a NATO standard. So apparently, according to these statements, the U.S. and NATO troops were in Ukraine already for several years. But after the special military operation started, they went in with support and went, way beyond arms shipment, going to daily battlefield cooperation, intelligence sharing, and joint strategy planning, practically, and this was the result of 300 interviews with Ukrainian and Western government and military officials, and the whole operation was organized on a daily, hourly basis in the U.S. Army garrison in Wiesbaden, which became the nerve center for this whole operation. Now, I just said a lot there in just 2 or 3 sentences. But this is what's coming out. This was in the New York Times, this article. I mean, even the Times from time to time surprises me. But this whole false Minsk Accord program to build up the Ukrainian forces to NATO standards using American intelligence, American training, American weaponry, headquartered in Wiesbaden, Germany. And Wiesbaden is right there on the Rhine River, where the Rhine runs east and west, right across from Mainz, M-A-I-N-Z, Mainz, Germany, and then north across the Rhine is Wiesbaden, which was American headquarters, military headquarters, for quite a while just before the end of the war. All right, I don't hear anything coming out of K-Talk right now, so I can turn K-Talk back on. So that's why, I mean, that's what's behind all these things that I've been talking about, is the immediacy of getting the Trump administration decapitated. Because all in all, and the back-talking, not back-talking, back-channel talking, and diplomatic stuff all the way back here last month to Riyadh between the United States and Russia looks like they can actually move to an end of the war, and Russia's not sitting there negotiating anything because Russia won the war. And unless there's a heavy influx, an awful lot more money and a lot more weaponry into the Ukraine, they probably can last till the end of June. April, May, June, 3 more months, and that's it. And the Russians aren't going to sit there and say, okay, we'll go home now. It's not about to happen. So while I'm trying to save civilization, why do you do, Jack? Why do you do what you do? I just can't sit back with my mouth shut. And just amazing, this, when information like the New York Times article comes out that I was talking about during the break there. This army garrison in Wiesbaden was the nerve center for this entire operation from 2014 in Wiesbaden, Germany, not Wiesbaden, Ukraine, Wiesbaden, Germany, by the U.S. State Department and the military arms to build up the Ukrainians because they thought they could actually get the Ukrainians to a point where they could bust up Russia politically, financially. So then Russia would have internal turmoil, and then with all the various religious groups and terrorist groups that still are in Russia, that Russia would have essentially civil war, and that Russia would then eventually be conquered by the West. The West could move in, break up Russia into 5 or 6 different countries, and then finally have control of all of the policies of those various countries and get their strategic minerals. Now, according to the Italian defense magazine, Analisi Difesa, its editor, Gianandrea Gianni, exposed the hoax behind the Macron-Starmer initiative, saying that it's not against the alleged Russian threat. It's a sabotage effort to destroy Trump's peace efforts. This just came out. You know, it's not only a couple of investigative groups that see what's going on here. A lot of these foreign countries are beginning to see more clearly what's taking place. He said this: the EU has already made it known that it will not lift sanctions on Moscow until Russian troops are completely withdrawn from Ukrainian territory. And in the final analysis, the Anglo-French plan does not seem to prove convincing, also because it's completely unworkable, since in order to accept an agreement, Moscow demands no NATO nation's forces on Ukrainian territory. So there will be no agreement with Moscow without this clause. And while it is that no NATO member nation can deploy troops to the Ukraine, since it has no military value, the coalition of the willing can have a double political significance, reviving the prominence of the 2 European nuclear powers and obstructing Trump's administration negotiation efforts. Well, at least someplace, people are saying what this is, namely a blatant attempt to sabotage the peace efforts in the Ukraine, and it's completely scandalous that Europe, and especially Germany, after 80 years since the end of World War II, would be engaged in such a reckless policy, and that is being observed by many people throughout the whole world, especially countries on the bottom half of the country in the global south of the planet. So when you look at a timeline showing that the entire armament project is really meant to be the last phase of the financial bailout, and now the European Union Rearm Europe plan von der Leyen is on the one side claiming that the reason why it's needed is because of the ongoing, ever-present Russian military threat, which does not exist. And it's clearly stated very, very clearly by anybody, from Colonel Macgregor to former General Kuyat, former General Ward, many other military experts, but that is being blamed as the big reason. And I even heard Macgregor on Napolitano not too long ago. There is no Russian military threat to Europe. And so naturally, Europe is going to have to take care of its own security because of the U.S. potential withdrawal of its nuclear umbrella, hence the coalition of the willing. And the reality, I think, is quite different, namely that while all the different phases of the previous maneuvers of the central banks to first have regime change, that's the first thing, let's just go change the government so we can get what we want, and then taking control of the budget away from the government, giving it to the central banks, then you have something as stupid as the Green Deal, which destroyed German industry like it was designed to do. And so now they're going into a big rearmament bubble bailout. And so Germany wants to rearm, and they want all the money and the bonds and the stocks and everything pointing to what Schacht did with German economy from, what, 1933 to 36, I think, was the presence of the Schachtian economics, backed up, of course, by Brown Brothers Harriman out of New York, to fund what built a huge, almost impossible to imagine, military force in less than a decade in post-Versailles Germany. Now, the present configuration of all the kinds of interesting observations and realignments and views and trips to Mar-a-Lago and Starmer and von der Leyen and Macron and stomping their feet. One of them comes from Timofey Borichev, who's an important Russian commentator and a sought-after analyst who is countering the argument that the present deployment that is going on will divide Russia and China. And he says it's the usual strategy of the West, of the British Empire, to divide and conquer, like they did after the Balfour Declaration to get control of the Middle East. It's not going to work, he said, in respect to Russia and China. Says the chances that will happen are zero. And he goes into the obvious reasons why. And then I don't want to go too far into that, but there was some interesting comments that were made by some Chinese scholars reflecting on the consequence of the havoc that Trump is creating in Europe. And they're talking about how this rift can be good for China and Russia relations, because they're about the only two left that are nuclear powered but have any way of defending themselves against an ever-encroaching Western economic power that has tried for a few hundred years now to gain and maintain control of the planet. So if China is seen as an enemy, China says, then everybody on this planet is an enemy. And he basically says that there needs to be a completely different approach going on. And at the time this is taking place, of trying to create these peaceful movements, Hegseth, Defense Secretary Hegseth, is in Southeast Asia trying to gear up Philippines for more war power against China. The corruption just the corruption and the control that is going on. I think the worst thing that can happen in the minds of the internationalists is peace between Russia and the United States, which would necessitate peace between the United States and China, and to turn into fair and open, active trading partners rather than nuclear enemies. Now, I was going to go into some of the stuff that's going on in Germany, but it's not necessary. In other European countries, there's very little. There was this very important conference in Slovakia demanding the immediate end of the EU sanctions against Russia, saying that all these sanctions always backfire, and the conference was entitled Slovakia Without Sanctions, which took place in the capital, Bratislava. And they're collecting petitions, and of which they have already 300,000 signatures. They only need 350,000 from the public themselves to make the president act on the fact that they will drop all sanctions themselves against Russia. So there's some bright hopes that this thing can spread even further, but at the same time, that's a threat to world dominion of the Anglo-American Empire. Now, I wanted to mention one more thing about the German schools. In the schools, there are protests because the Bundeswehr is now sending youth officers into schools, and in Bavaria, according to state army law, Landesbundeswehrgesetz, that the schools have to work with the Bundeswehr. Can you imagine a law like that here in Salt Lake County or even the state of Utah? A law passed by the Utah legislature, signed by the governor, or allowed to go through without the governor's signature. That would make it lawful for the Army, whether National Guard or the various branches of the services or whatever else, to come into schools whenever they want and to set up all their displays and all their videos and all their games and everything else, advertising for young people to join the Army or Navy or Air Force, Marines, Merchant Marines, Coast Guard, whatever else. And there are several teachers in Bavaria who are very upset about this because of the constant political upset that's going on in the minds of German people now anyway because of MERS getting in and what MERS is planning on doing. MERS still hasn't got a government. And the AFD, the alternate, MERS's numbers are dropping, the AFD numbers are increasing. And in the midst of that confusion as to what they're going to do for the future of Germany, their industry is leaving because of the high prices of energy, because of the bombing of the Nord Stream. And in the midst of all of that, the Army, the Bundeswehr, is coming into the high schools, trying to get the kids to understand they have no alternative but to join the Army. There's this very interesting article I just want to mention here as I'm kind of moving away from these subjects by Australian journalist Graham Rice, H-R-Y-C-E, Rice, who debunks the argument that Trump is a fascist. He says it's quite useful for all those people who have Trump derangement syndrome, because he makes it a very convincing argument that the idea that Trump is a fascist is completely unfitting, because Trump is a populist who has no coherent ideology. In fact, he says Trump is not ideological at all. He's very pragmatic. He's very deal-oriented. And if you call that an ideology, then that is one. But it's not the kind of fascist ideology. Sorry, there's something popping up on the radio here. I just need to know if they're going to play a commercial or something. Yeah, I got some commercials playing. So then to contrast, he just says Trump is not the fascist that Western publications and cries of people in America are trying to make him out to be. Because most of the people who are calling him a fascist don't even know what fascism is. They're just suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. And that Trump is just a populist. All right, sounds like that commercial's over. And so that's why they say he's just, he's deal oriented. So then to contrast the present craziness in the West, whatever left of it there is, this gigantic earthquake in Myanmar. And it was in Thailand and Vietnam and Laos, also in China, and Yunnan and Guangxi and Guizhou. But alone in Myanmar, I mean, this giant earthquake wasn't just limited to Myanmar. There was shaking going on all over the place. And they say there's 1,700 people killed so far. Many are still buried, but the earthquake has severely damaged the roads, the bridges, the airports, communications infrastructure, hospitals, other medical facilities, and therefore the rescue operations are extremely difficult because the infrastructure that's needed to support the rebuilding of the infrastructure is gone. So within 24 hours, China had dispatched numerous rescue teams to Myanmar with provisions of emergency humanitarian help and aid. So I think it's quite in contrast to some of the natural disaster relief that we still see lacking to a big degree in this country. I also wanted to mention in Hungary, the foreign minister blasted the European Union, demanding that this was just out of Brussels a week or two ago, that every European Union citizen should be prepared to have an essential supply kit for at least 72 hours in the event there is a war. Now, how long have we promoted that at K-Talk Radio? A 72-hour emergency kit. And then, of course, the LDS Church has done that, and other church groups and relief groups and emergency groups, preparedness groups, having a 72-hour kit, of water, food, and warmth, that kind of stuff. Well, it came out of Brussels a week ago that all the European Union citizens should have a 72-hour survival kit. And when he was asked why, he said, why in the 21st century should EU citizens prepare a survival kit? There's only one explanation: preparing for war. At a time when there's finally a chance for a ceasefire in Ukraine and meaningful peace talks with Trump's return to office, Brussels is going to the opposite direction, clinging to this failed pro-war policy. And that's, I think that could be useful to some degree, because jumping back to the United States, this idiocy that somehow Russia and China are enemies of the United States. As I said there a few moments ago, Defense Secretary Hegseth in Tokyo, I said Philippines, I meant Tokyo, talking to the Japanese Defense Minister, Nakatani. He says, Japan is our indispensable partner in deterring communist Chinese military aggression. Now, with that kind of rhetoric, which obviously is meant to prepare for the coming conflict with China, and I think that is equally doomed to fail like all the other efforts to prevent the BRICS and the rising global south from playing a role on the planet. The only way how to get out of this is with a completely new paradigm. And I like the paradigm that the Schiller Institute has to offer. That makes the most sense to me, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. So I think it's really, I have a memory of many, many successful attempts since I was in high school in the 60s. When you can get enough people together to change the course of events. And there was, I ran across this statement recently by Confucius. And you know, Chinese, whether it's the Communist Party or the Chinese citizenry or whatever else, their culture is based on Confucianism. And Confucianism is based on science, it's based on culture, and it's based on business. And instead of making war and losing all your youth to conquer another group that's losing all of their youth, you sit down and you talk about your differences and how you're going to work them out and do business with one another. China's never attacked anybody. They've been involved with some wars, but they didn't start it and they didn't do the attacking. They don't want to have war. They want to do business. So I ran across this statement by Confucius where he said, if you look at the music of a nation, and if you don't remember anything else I had to say today, I want you to think about this. Confucius talking about this. Confucius said, when you look at the music of a nation, you can see how their ability to survive is situated. Because they have a very strong cultural background. And there are Chinese artists who come over here, the Shunyan and some of the other stuff that's going on, goes back hundreds of years. I mean, China is it 5,000 years? It's at least 3,000 year culture. And Confucius said that if you just look at the music of a nation, you know their ability to survive. Now, I have to bring this up. I might have done this once before, a few months ago when I first saw it, but there was this thing on, I don't know if it was TikTok or X or Facebook or YouTube or what, and somebody artistically was comparing a love song written and produced by Led Zeppelin back in the early 70s and a song that got popular for a while in the top 40 in America, written by a very popular younger black lady. I can't think of her name offhand. And the Led Zeppelin song from the early 70s, I love you, you're my life, you're my future, I want to be with you, I want to be a part of you, and on and on. And this song that was popular last year, and the lyrics, I have to do this because it's unbelievable. The lyrics go like this: you a hoe, you a hoe, you a ho ho ho, you a hoe, you a hoe, you a hoe. And it was very popular on the radio for a while. And so when I read this statement by Confucius, that if you look at the music of a nation, it'll tell you its ability to survive, that was the first thing that came to mind. So what's our ability to survive in this country? I mean, the Western countries are in a terrible condition. And so obviously a new paradigm is absolutely necessary here. All right, now a couple of more things. I'm just zipping through my notes here. Nature magazine places China. It's a British science weekly, and it often rates nations in their scientific standings. Has placed 9 of the world's top 10 research institutions. What country? think about it for a minute. Nature magazine, a British publication, will often rank nations in their scientific abilities. And so they placed 9 of the world's top 10 research institutions in China, with Harvard being the sole Western presence in the top 10. And so when Nature first ranked released its first rankings in 2014, only 8 Chinese universities made it in the top 100. That number is now quintupled, with 42 Chinese institutions now ranked among the world's best, surpassing 36 American and 4 British. And while the U.S. still holds the lead in biotechnology and biomedicine, China is quickly closing the gap for that. And in other fields, they're already in the lead in quantum computing. The latest developments indicate that China will have a functioning fusion-fission reactor by 2030, the first commercial reactor to use fusion energy commercially, where it consumes its own waste. It's just a step away from developing a full thermonuclear reactor producing electricity. And China is already working on the engineering design of such a reactor, which is now predicted to be online by 2050. China has also operative in the development of hypersonic weapons. While we're still working on a prototype, China also seems to hold the lead in brain-computer interfaces, planning on having a major clinical trial. Elon Musk's company Neuralink is the major competitor in this area. Imagine having a chip in your head that you can talk to a computer with. Man, that just blows my mind. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out. And then the Greenland thing. Just wanted to mention something about that. I think is important, because this is another. What started out as the second lady, Usha Vance's soft power trip to see the national sled dog race in Greenland's second largest city, Sisimiut, ended up being a high-level visit by Vice President J.D. Vance, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, Energy Secretary Chris Wright, and Senator Mike Lee from Utah to the only U.S. military base, the Patuxent Space Base. And the plans were changed after it was clear that the Greenlanders would demonstrate against the U.S. delegation visiting their cities, given that due to President Trump has repeatedly called for the U.S. to take over Greenland, and the Danish Prime Minister Frederiksen stated that the U.S. was putting Greenland and Denmark under unacceptable pressure, which the country is going to resist. So during his speech, Vance alleged that the Russians and the Chinese are threatening Greenland. And the Greenlanders should not think that they would be better off under the Chinese Communist Party, and he alleged that the Chinese are putting Greenland into a debt trap. So in somewhat forceful terms, Vance said that Denmark has failed for decades to ensure the security of the U.S. military base and the Greenlanders. And on the one hand, he said Greenland has the right of self-determination to become independent, and he hoped that they would choose to come under U.S. security umbrella. But on the other hand, he emphasized that the United States has to have control of Greenland for national and international security. And asked if the U.S. would increase its military presence there, he said not immediately, but in the future. And asked if the U.S. would use military force to take over Greenland, he said, I don't think that's necessary. So the Danish commentators and the media called this a frontal attack on Denmark and an attempt to split Denmark from Greenland. And while the Greenlanders and the Danes breathed this momentary sigh of relief that Vance did not threaten military action to take Greenland, President Trump did just that very night. On March 29th, after the Danish Foreign Minister Rasmussen's statement in English to the Americans via social media, denouncing the tone of his criticism, but saying that both U.S. military presence and mineral mining could be negotiated, Trump insisted on NBC News Sunday, I never take military force off the table, when he was asked about acquiring Greenland. Another outrageous statement by our president. I never take military force off the table. Well, the escalating Greenland crisis is exacerbating the rift between the U.S. and the United States anyway, just further. So, we are continuing to bomb Yemen. The U.S. continues to bomb one of the poorest countries on the earth. I don't know if you have seen pictures of downtown Yemen. Suspected U.S. airstrikes around Yemen's rebel-held capital last night and into this morning. The Houthis said at least one person was killed. This is reported in the Associated Press. The full extent of the damage and possible casualties hasn't been made clear yet, but the attacks followed a night of airstrikes early on March 28th that appeared particularly intense compared to the other days that the campaign began on March 15th. So the Associated Press cites the Houthis' Al-Misra satellite news channel aired footage of broken glass littering homes, the concussive blast of the bombs, but continued not to show the targets of the attacks, suggesting the sites had a military or an intelligence function. So an AP review has found the new American operation against the Houthis under Donald Trump appears more extensive than those under Joe Biden, as the U.S. moves from solely targeting launch sites to firing at ranking personnel, as well as dropping bombs in the cities. And this is the thing that got me so agitated yesterday: the killing of innocent Houthis. Now, I should say Yemenis. Now, Houthis are called Houthis because they're followers of Houthi. Houthi is the leader of this revolutionary rebellion group. And so those who follow him are considered Houthis. But sometimes the terms between Yemenis, in the citizens of Yemen, and the Houthis that are in Yemen get interchanged. And it's important to know the difference. So I was going to go into, there's something else I want to talk about, but I was going to go into Netanyahu and two of his aides that have been arrested in the Qatar investigation. This is something that's going to hang heavy over Netanyahu. I think I might, there's more that needs to be developed about that. I think I might let that wait until next week. I do want to talk a little bit more about Diego Garcia. What do we got here? About 20 minutes. Retired Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who is a guest on the Napolitano podcast, he said a war with Iran would be 10 to 15 times worse than the Iraq war in terms of casualties and costs, and we would lose. We would undoubtedly lose. So there's been a lot of this discussion about the relocation of the B-2 bombers to Diego Garcia in anticipation of this potential conflict with Iran. However, the B-2 excels primarily against small, unsophisticated, impoverished nations equipped with outdated air defense systems. So in short, the B-2 is a sophisticated tool for intimidating weaker adversaries like Somalia, but it's largely ineffective against modern integrated air defense systems. And you look at the S-400 systems that Iran has obtained from Russia, and that they think this is one of the reasons why, with a lot of the air-to-ground missiles that were launched by F-35s and F-16s against Iran in their last brouhaha here, a year ago, a lot of them were shot down, never made it to the ground because of the S-400 defense systems. And there's only one better than that, and that's the S-500 that surrounds Moscow and other cities in Russia, that apparently can stop anything miles and miles and miles away from its target. So when you consider a potential conflict with Iran, and they already have the Carl Vinson aircraft carriers there. Two more are coming, which I believe are the Ford and the Reagan. And what they're loaded with, and the entire flotilla that comes with them to defend them, to refuel them, and the B-2 stealth bombers amassing in Diego Garcia, along with the numerous C-17 transport planes and the KC-135 refueling tankers, and an Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine and two carrier groups. How else are you supposed to see this? But a buildup for an attack on Iran. And so Trump's ominous warning, when he said if they won't deal, there could be bombing. Trump said this: Iran is very high on my list of things to watch. We will have to talk it out, or very bad things are going to happen to Iran. My big preference is that we work it out with Iran. But if we don't work it out, bad things are going to happen to Iran. And he said this on national television just the other day. And the increase in warnings, along with the deployment of B-2 bombers, obviously is causing a bit of a stir, because many who now believe that Trump is planning to target Iran's nuclear facilities with low-yield nuclear bunker buster bombs that are designed to penetrate and destroy underground fortified facilities. If that action were to take place, Iran would be forced to launch massive retaliatory attacks on U.S. and Israeli bases, naval assets, critical infrastructure, oil facilities all across the Middle East. And if those attacks were able to inflict significant damage on U.S. or Israeli targets, then you would see a rapid escalation to a nuclear war, in a scenario that seems more likely now than even when it was in the Ukraine. Now, this is something that Scott Ritter had to say. I'm quoting from Scott Ritter. 7 B-2 bombers have been deployed from Whitman Air Force Base in the United States to Diego Garcia. This is an unprecedented deployment, and they are matched with 10 KC-31 tankers. That's what's needed to launch an attack against a target like Iran. This is something that should wake people up, because there is a real potential for conflict. The fact is, there are B-2 bombers, there are Ohio-class submarines, there are nuclear weapons attached to each of these weapon systems, nuclear weapons that have been built for the sole purpose of attacking targets like those in Iran. And I'm simply stating the fact that the Trump administration has a nuclear posture attached to a nuclear employment plan that will use nuclear weapons in a conflict against Iran, and we can't pretend that that doesn't exist. So I think it's worth noting that the Trump administration is on the verge of launching a war on a country that poses no national security threat to the United States, nor does it threaten U.S. interests in the entire Western Asian region. Iran's only crime is that it occupies a piece of real estate where Israel is determined to be the dominant power. And that means Iran's military capability must be significantly diminished by Israel's favorite pit bull, the United States. And to that end, the wealthy Zionists filled up Trump's campaign coffers during the last election, knowing that Trump's vast popularity would be useful in advancing the Israeli agenda. And the primary goal of that agenda has always been the obliteration of Iran's military capability, so that Israel can emerge as the regional hegemon unopposed. Trump is merely playing the role for which he was chosen. Here's more from Ritter, Scott Ritter. When Trump was last president, 2016, he redid the Nuclear Posture Review and the Nuclear Employment Guidance. And the Nuclear Employment Guidance is the war plan. And the war plan was rewritten so that he could launch nuclear strikes on Iran. So we're ready to launch strikes on Iran today. The plan was implemented. We have the weapons. We've identified the targets. Question: what was rewritten? Ritter: you need specific weapons types. We do now have a new nuclear, low-yield, station ID at KTalk. It's interesting that that station ID would come on so early. So, question: what was rewritten? Ritter: you need specific weapons types. We do now have a new nuclear, low-yield, bunker-busting bomb that will penetrate and destroy the facility with minimal fallout. We have similar nukes on Trident submarines in the region that can be used in a decapitation strike on Iran. We are ready to go to war against Iran. We've already made the decision. The plan exists, for crying out loud. Question: so what you're telling me is that if Iran develops a nuclear weapon and then Ritter interrupts, we will strike and they will be annihilated. They will never know what hit them, and they'll never recover from it. The American plan will not kill tens of millions of Iranians, but it will kill tens of thousands of Iranians, destroy the nuclear infrastructure, and set Iran back forever. The alternative is for Iran to negotiate away their nuclear program. Now, I've listened to and followed Ritter long enough now that when he's worried, when he's agitated, when he acts even the least bit frightful in some of his podcasting or appearance on Napolitano's program, that's something to sit up and take notice of when Ritter is worried. He seriously believes that Trump is planning to preemptively attack Iran's nuclear sites, which would set the dominoes in motion that would eventually trigger a nuclear war. Now, I think this seems like a reasonable concern, but surprisingly, Ritter's analysis has ignited a firestorm among a number of his supporters online who have overnight turned into some of his most vicious critics. I have here a short clip from a post by Sony Thang, T-H-A-N-G, that's widely circulated on X. Scott: let me tell you plainly, if the U.S. uses nuclear weapons against Iran, even tactical ones, the spell breaks forever. The myth of Western restraint dies in the open. The lie of rules-based order evaporates in radioactive dust. China won't wait to be next. Russia will tighten its alliance with Tehran. The global South will turn its back for good, and every nation not under Washington's boot will know the truth. If you don't arm yourself, you will be annihilated. That's not proliferation, that's inevitability. You say only one nation walks away. No, Scott, no one walks away from nuclear war, not cleanly, not economically, not morally, but let's entertain your scenario. Iran is wiped out. Oil hits $500 a barrel. The Strait of Hormuz is a graveyard. The global economy implodes, not just at Europe and Asia, but the dollar itself, because trust dies when the empire burns its last moral pretense. And here's the part of your Pentagon fantasies you never compute. It's not just bombs that bring nations to their knees. It's legitimacy, and once lost, never regained. And the U.S., already staggering from endless wars, it won't rise from the ashes of another charred country. It'll sink into them. You claim assess the world as it is, then look again. The American empire is not ascending. It's cornered. It's flailing. It's threatening annihilation, not out of strength, but fear. fear that the world it dominated is slipping away, and fear that Iran refuses to kneel, and fear that history, once you've claimed would hold America accountable, is no longer on your side. So keep listing your bombers and your submarines and your low-yield fantasies, because beneath all that steel and strategy lies a single truth. You have already lost the moral war. And when that goes, everything else follows. Sony Thang, T-H-A-N-G on X. So the overall thrust of these critiques is the tacit objection to any move by Iran to compromise or negotiate with the Trump administration. This is generally perceived as caving in to the evil empire. And in many respects, that's true. But it's worth noting that Iran is not currently in violation of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, nor has it been in the past. In fact, Iran has willingly complied with numerous additional protocols and confidence-building measures that were never imposed on any other country, all aimed at allaying fears that it was secretly developing nuclear weapons. But as Tulsi Gabbard confirmed recently, and former CIA Director William Burns before her, Iran does not have nukes. Iran is not building nukes. It has not broken its agreement under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the whole matter is a mendacious confection concocted by Zionists and their media collaborators who want to destroy Iran for Israel to become the dominant power in the Middle East. Now, it's worth noting the dishonest way this crisis has been presented to the American people, because the public have been led to believe that Trump is trying to prevent nuclear proliferation, when in fact the administration is simply demanding that Iran abandon its ballistic missile program as well. So, a week ago on Face the Nation, Trump's advisor Mike Waltz stated bluntly that Trump demands include the dismantling of Iran's strategic missile program. But Iran's ballistic missiles do not violate any international law, nor are they banned under any treaty obligation. Trump is simply ordering Iran to surrender the means by which it could defend itself or face military action by the U.S. Is that a reasonable demand? If they don't deal, there will be bombing? No, that's national suicide. And once again, the origin of this insanity is Benjamin Netanyahu has consistently urged the U.S. to take stronger action against Iran's missile capabilities. So Israeli agents in Congress introduced the Missiles Act in July of 2023 to codify U.S. sanctions on Iran's missile and drone programs, citing Israel's security. And at the same time, Trump's maximum pressure campaign has included missile-related entities credited to Netanyahu's input. So, in short, what does all this mean? It means that Iran is being asked to willingly disarm itself so that Israel can do to Iran what it's currently doing to Syria and Lebanon. And why would they do that? Well, they won't. They'll just open back-channel communications with Trump's envoys and continue to comply with their treaty obligations, but eventually Trump will order airstrikes on nuclear targets in Iran, signaling the beginning of the war. And that will pit America's out-of-date weapons cache up against Israel's state-of-the-art ballistic missile systems, which will, as Will Shriver opines, expose American weaknesses and not reinforce the widespread mythology of untouchable American strength. And the reasons for this is easy to understand. Because following last year's tit-for-tat missile attacks, as I was talking about, between Israel and Iran, a fantastical narrative emerged that Israeli airstrikes on Iran were successful, while Iranian missile attacks on Israel failed to do any damage. But nothing could be further from the truth. Israel's air campaign was sharply rebuffed by Iran's advanced multi-layered air defense systems, while the vast majority of Iran's long-range hypersonic missiles cut through Israel's vaunted air defense systems, striking targets without any interference. I remember that clearly, and I also remember the story of two Israeli piloted F-35s coming up through the southern Persian Gulf towards Iran. And the one pilot said, I'm on a missile target, 300 miles away from Iran. And they veered off and headed back towards Israel. Because they have the Russian air defense systems. One of the earliest of the week Napolitano podcasts is with Alistair Crook. And back in October 26th, when Israel, the question was asked of him, the attack by Israel against Iran, and the question was asked, do I have time to get into this? Did Israel cause any meaningful damage to Iran in its attack on October 26th? No, but something significant did happen, because the attack was supposed to lead off with the destruction of the air defense systems, what they called the suppression of enemy air defenses. The aircraft was supposed to destroy the air defenses in Iraq, Syria, and Iran, so the second and third waves would come in with conventional weapons to destroy the targets that had been selected for them. But the second and third wave can only enter Iranian airspace if it was safe for them to do that. In other words, if the air defenses had been properly suppressed. Now, what happened, although we don't know precisely, is that those second and third waves never happened. We got into the first wave, and the Israelis said, that's it, we're finished. It's over. We won. It's a great success. What seems to have happened is that the Israeli aircraft, with their long-range missiles to destroy the air defense systems, never got closer than 70 kilometers to Iran, too far for their missiles to lock on the air defense systems because they needed signals to lock onto. The key thing that they said, and this is from Israeli sources, we've discovered an unknown air defense system over Tehran province. That's the thing I was mentioning a minute ago. So what seems to have happened is that the Israeli aircraft, were being locked onto by another air defense system, and they were frightened to go ahead, and they scrapped the attack. Then they simply released their long-range missile. Most of these missiles are guided by GPS, and the Russians are highly adept at jamming GPS. But this unexplained air defense system was possibly a Russian air defense system that can attack stealth fighters like the F-35s. If you have a missile that has radar capacity that is able to identify a stealth fighter, then the whole idea of the attack on Iran seems to have collapsed. So something is playing there. But I may have, hopefully we are not at war with Iran by the first of next week. Talking to you on the stream, I think that might be the end of my broadcast at K-Talk. Just keep your wits about you and pray desperately that President Trump can come to his senses and throw off the shackles of Israeli command and control of his administration. You all be good out there. I'll be back tomorrow with a health show I think you'll find interesting. But it's time to bring this to an end. I really appreciate your being a part of this. If you can refer this, whatever you call it, subscribe, whatever else, share it, would help to build the audience. So I will see you all tomorrow.